History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 191, Staging Julius Caesar, a conversation with Ricky Jukes. For today's guest episode, it is a welcome return to Ricky Jukes, Artistic Director of Lazarus Theatre Company. Following on from our conversation about Henry V, Ricky and I went on to discuss Julius Caesar. Not surprisingly, our conversation pulled out some alternative points to those that I raised in my episode on the play, especially when it came to talking about aspects of staging the play and the impact of the female roles, which I didn't mention in any detail previously. So, please see these two episodes as complementary to each other, but as long as you are familiar with the play, you don't need to have listened to my episode first, or for that matter, our earlier discussion of Henry V, in order to enjoy this one. Ricky Jukes is an award-winning director, practitioner and teacher based in the West Midlands and London. In 2007 he founded Lazarus Theatre Company and is the company's current artistic director, for which he has won the Best Artistic Director in the 2012 Fringe Report Awards. His work is ensemble-led with actor detail at its heart, creating large-scale, visual, visceral and vibrant theatrical experiences. Ricky has gone on to direct over 40 productions for Lazarus Theatre, including The Changeling, Hamlet, Dr. Faustus, Oscar Wilde's Salome, Macbeth, Marlowe's Edward II, The Caucasian Chalk Circle, 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, and Dido, Queen of Carthage. Ricky also runs workshops for actors under the Lazarus Gym banner, and I've put links in the show notes to his activities so that you can follow up further on that if you wish. I spoke to Ricky over a Zoom call from his home in London. My take on Julius Caesar is that it is a more political play than Henry V that we talked about last time. So would you agree with that? Or do you think it's a play that's as timeless as Henry and not specifically political?
I think it's a play of kind of two worlds. So yes, the political world, but there's also something incredibly connected to nature and spirituality in the play. There's no coincidence, I don't think, in all the thunder cues, or the lightning, or the stuff that's happening, certainly in the first half of the play. And of course...
Yeah, there is a lot of lightning.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, the soothsayer. So there's this spirituality about it, which I think in productions we sometimes wrestle with. And when we were preparing for a production that was meant to happen last year and we had to postpone it, but it will be back, we will do that production, but it was due to play last year at Southwark Playhouse. It's a play that's actually quite a lot of scenes are outside, and so then when you're doing it in an inside venue, you sort of get, how are we going to sort of juggle that? And so in the end, we went down with a concept of setting it very much indoors. So that was quite a useful tool then for cutting and editing. So you could still have the thunder and the lightning, but it's not that we're outside experiencing it. It's coming through windows or it's coming from outside. And what it created was this inside of false security, and the outside world was this dangerous, treacherous place. But actually the irony being the treachery is happening indoors, because spoiler alert, Caesar gets it.
Yes. Nobody can trust a senator, apparently.
Well, quite. I mean, if there's ever a lesson for all ages. So I think it is inherently political, but I think there's an interesting one thing we were really wrangling with what is the soothsayer, who is the soothsayer in a purely political world. But interestingly, research we were doing, there have been presidents and prime ministers who have had religious consultants. So it's interesting how much of that still plays a part in our what we would perhaps consider more secular public servant, but actually still has a religious or a spiritual guide, and I mean that professionally, not just personally. That famous picture of Mr. Trump, President Trump, sat with all those church folk with their hands on him, you know, and I suspect that's probably more performative than anything else. It looks great to a certain base. But I don't know him, so that might be completely wide of the mark. Maybe he is a deeply spiritual, reflective person. I don't know. But you see, interesting then that perhaps that's what the soothsayer is in that world. And interestingly, as the play starts, we find out that Caesar did used to listen to the soothsayers, and it did him well on his military campaigns. the interesting thing as the play starts is he stopped listening to them. Almost he's got a little bit above them. I don't need your advice actually anymore. And that might be one of his first mistakes, perhaps.
Yes.
And doesn't really know who this soothsayer is. So does that mean he doesn't know who soothsayers are, or just doesn't know that particular soothsayer, or in the staging is in the crowd so doesn't actually know who says it? So there's lots of sort of logistics in the staging. Do I know who it is? Is it a voice I recognise? Or I guess costuming, are they coming out in whatever a soothsayer would wear? And we tried different things in workshops. With the soothsayer, a member of the staff, like an apprentice, or at one point they were a cleaner. So how would they get into these high offices of state? Well, maybe the cleaner. There was one version where we did it. They were the Pret sandwich guy. So they were delivered sandwiches to the third floor. And all of them were great in their own way, but kind of reductive to what Shakespeare was doing. And in the last sort of iteration before we went into rehearsal with it, there was a spiritual advisor. And we did one workshop where brilliantly, bizarrely, pulled out a tray of entrails on this very contemporary office desk and this very contemporary office world. We set it basically in a media spin room. And so you had all this paperwork and technology, but at the same time, you had this fairly archaic, ritualistic practice of offal and entrails, and someone was reading them and it just looked completely bizarre, but I loved that clash. So yes, I think it is one of his most inherent political. That's at the fore, isn't it? But the spirituality and nature, either directly feeding into it or as a metaphor backing up the themes. But I think again, the joy of workshopping and R&D. And one actor said to me, "But the thing is, Ricky, aren't most of these scenes outside? And if we set it inside, are we not missing something?" And that's, again, why collaboration's key, because that's someone who reminds you of something you might not have taken your eye off. And so we then went through the play dramaturgically, looking at and identifying what are we losing by not having it outside? And is there a way in the indoor version that can still be linked, we could still use, so we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater? So yes, and is my answer to that.
That's fair enough. When we were talking about Henry V before, you mentioned briefly that you had been involved in a production where you'd cut the beginning of the play.
Yes.
Up to Caesar's death.
Yes.
So do you want to just unpack that for us and tell us how that would have worked?
Well, if anyone wants a Google half an hour, check out the Stage Newspaper's review of it, which was, I think we were in the top 10 of worst shows that year. For that very reason. How dare they cut the title character? And I was young, and this was when was this? 2010, I think it was. And again, theatre often comes back to pragmatism. We were in a studio theatre, the Blue Elephant Theatre in Camberwell, where we were working a lot at the time, and audiences just don't want to sit for any more than 90 minutes. The benches are hard. And I know this sounds like an excuse and sounds a bit, oh, come on. But I think the audience experience isn't just what happens on stage. I think it's the whole thing. It's the journeying to the venue. It's the venue itself. It's the atmosphere. It's the staff in that venue. That is the entire experience. Like nowadays, the Globe marketing team are playing on that experience. Come to the Globe. The whole thing's the experience. But I think theatre going, the whole thing is the experience too. So there's no point doing a 3.5 hour version of a play where you already know 80 minutes in people are going to be uncomfortable and not want to sit through the whole thing. So it was looking at the play, although one of Shakespeare's shortest, is there something? And at the time, my dramaturgy was very much about, instead of just pruning here and there, and then a little bit like a great woolen jumper, Shakespeare, I find, if you start tugging at one point of the jumper, a hole appears somewhere else. Yeah. So what I used to find dramaturgically was I was about to say better, how dare I? One thing I found maybe simpler was just to remove an act. And so with that, we thought, what if the play starts with thunder and lightning and the murder? And that will murder/assassination/freedom fighting, whatever you want to call it. But the audience are then plummeted and plunged and thrown into this utter chaos. Because later in the play, you hear about what Rome was like before. So you'd be able to get an instinct, a feeling, an idea from the things that characters say about what Rome was like before Caesar and during his sort of last, what happens in Act 1. So we felt there was enough dramaturgy to sort of keep that thing going. Some audiences loved it, some audiences hated it. And that's possibly sometimes the best theatre, because it makes us sit up, particularly with a classic, and go, hang on, this is not the Caesar I knew. To which my response is always good. It doesn't matter what it is. We did a production of Hamlet fairly recently where we cut all the adult characters. I can hear people listening now gasping, how dare you? We did have one strongly worded letter. How dare you cut Polonius? He is the greatest character of all time. And I thought, crikey, I feel strongly about things, but I'm not sure I feel that strongly about Polonius. Anywho, and the reason being was because the brief of that, we were working with Southwark Playhouse and their young company. And so it was really about exploring young people's mental health. And we'd sort of seen some of that in Hamlet's journey. And so that was the brief of the production. But interestingly, one review said, this is not the Hamlet that I saw in 1969. Well, great, because we're not in nothing against the production of that production, but we're not there. So in a way, by cutting that, would I do that now? No, and we weren't going to do that in the 2024 production either. But it certainly put cats amongst soothsayers.
Yeah,
it was certainly something. Now I would actually, the edit of the 2024 version was a bit more of Act 4 and 5 nipped. So I have gone back to sort of the snipping here and there, but you've just got to keep your eyes open elsewhere. And there's an argument, and I've had this before in Q&As, where people say, well, why do these plays then if you're going to cut them? I think because they're great enough that you can re-see them, you can see new things in them. And I always reassure creatives and casts, if people hate this version, don't worry, there'll be another one soon. Particularly in the case of Hamlet, there were 4 more after our production, high profile ones.
Yes.
So don't worry, the world isn't going to end. Conversely, though, we've commissioned a new play, and we're working on that. I probably wouldn't do that to a new play. You wouldn't be allowed to anyway, because you'd be part of the original production. But I think if it was a more obscure play, like The Changeling, I hardly touched any of it, really. Well, actually, that's possibly not true. I did cut quite a bit, actually. Let's take that back. But, not in the same way as a whole act going.
Right, yeah.
And still feeling like with The Changeling that we did in 2023, even though the hospital plot had been heavily cut, it was represented. Mm-hmm. Rather than just removed altogether. Going back to that thing I've been really banging on about recently, is context is key. So you've got to have the full context, even if it's not the text. It's got to be represented or the context. Otherwise, we lose so much context of the thing that is still being staged.
So, given context is key, do you think we'll be seeing more productions of Julius Caesar if we're moving into a world that's more going to be run by oligarchs?
Well, I think we will, but I think it might be behind the curve, and that's why my one resistance to coming back to it, actually, because in 2024 it was the year that the most amount of people in the world were about to vote.
Yes, that's
and that was one of the stimulus for doing that production. I think if theatres are doing them next year, the year after, they'll feel slightly after the event, perhaps. I don't know. It depends on where they set them. But I wouldn't be surprised, because there hasn't been a major production of it for a bit. So I wouldn't be surprised if they roll around. Whether that's got anything to do with the oligarchy, I don't know. But it's frightening, though, isn't it? I think Shakespeare sends us a bit of a warning. Because, there's moments in that play where you go, Brutus and the conspirators seem to be doing it for I don't want to judge or moralize, but they're doing it for reasons they think are good enough. The biggest warning that I get from the play is kind of careful what you wish for and forward planning. Because, of course, once Caesar's gone, the very thing that they end up, don't they, at the end of the play, and history tells us, they end up with the thing they were very much trying to fight against.
Yes.
Is that Shakespeare warning us against uprising? Is that him saying you just have to put up with the monarch and you just have to put up with it? I don't know. I think there's just warnings of how to do a uprising properly. It's a tricky one. Oligarchs, I guess it's just frightening. When just early on the radio today, I was listening to President Trump is meeting with Putin in Alaska to decide the fate of European borders. I mean, I sort of get that's the way the world works, but it seems entirely wrong to me, that the country whose borders are being moved aren't even in that conversation. I think that's frightening.
Let's move on. Let's move back 400 years again, because it's safer. I also think the female roles in Julius Caesar are interesting ones, because they are, on the face of it, quite minor. But then, of course, you realise they're not minor at all. What were your thoughts on how you handled that? I take it they weren't cut from your production.
No, they were definitely there. I think on one level, and going back to something we discussed before about the characters as a device, what do they offer? And I think both Calpurnia and Portia offer us an insight into Caesar and Brutus that we wouldn't see if we didn't meet them. But there is an element of, well, is the only representation of women in this play wives? But I would sort of push back on that a bit and go, but Portia is remarkable. She doesn't have a great deal to say, but she does have agency. And I think that's the thing to tap into. I think most productions now end up regendering one of the other major male roles, whether that be Cassius. I've seen a version where Mark Antony was played female too. I've seen a version actually where Brutus was female and Portia remained female. So that brought an extra sort of sexuality dimension to the thing. So no, I wouldn't cut them. I think that the tricky thing is making sure that they don't fall into the sort of sideline characters, so that we're all completely working out and aware of what they bring to the bigger part of it. Without Portia, you wouldn't see. I think Brutus shares with the audience quite a lot his hesitation, his worries, his concerns. Yeah. But Portia just brings another side to that. And that scene where, in their orchard, when the conspirators have just been there, on the face of it, he feels more concerned about what he's about to do and what the conspirators are going to say. But actually, when she comes out, he's more concerned for her well-being, her welfare. So you could play it, perhaps, that he's scared she'll tell on him. But actually, when we worked on it, it actually was far deeper than that. He knows she'll say, don't do it. So she's sort of the moral compass. If you want to bring morals into it, I don't know whether we should into theatre, but she would say to him, "What are you doing?" She knows him so well, doesn't she? All the observations. She says you stamped your foot and you waved your hand, and in a workshop we did, that's exactly what he did later when he tried to dismiss her. So it's all true. She knows him so well that he wafts his hand, stamps his foot, and he sighs and he muses and he gets impatient. And I love that line where she says, which sometimes men do have with their behavior. I'm paraphrasing, but she knows that men are moody sometimes. There's also something, I suppose, about Portia to say. Shakespeare elevates her, I guess, to say that she's Cato's daughter. And, she says, I might be a woman, but I'm not just any woman, which, again, in a workshop, we found read a bit misogynistic. But actually, again, in another way, you could play it slightly differently, that it's actually her saying how important or how vital she is, or, how educated she is, or intellectual she is, or her position. And of course, it evokes that speech Elizabeth I is purported to have said, I might have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but, the mind of a man. So there's this real sort of strength in them. So there's only two of them, which isn't great when you're trying to do gender balanced casting.
No.
But when they're on, and extremely powerful. We didn't do much work on Calpurnia's scene. Often she's, I think, quite easily batted away. But I think there's something more in that she's a resistance to what he wants to do. And I found it, when reading that scene, quite heartbreaking that when Decius Brutus comes in and says, oh no, she's got the dream all wrong, stupid woman, don't believe any of that. Caesar's only too happy because it's convenient for him, because he might get crowned that day. The women are the voices of warning. They're the women. They're the voices of reason and caution and consideration. And the men,
yes, which is actually quite a Shakespearean trait, isn't it, for the women to take that role?
Yeah. So you might say, that actor might say, oh gosh, she hasn't got a lot to do, has she? She's only in this little bit here, and then shouts at a soothsayer for a bit. And you go, yeah, but again, going back to that device idea, how remarkable of a device or as a pillar of something that they represent. And of course, an actor can't play pillars of representation of themes. They can't play that. But if the actor and in the room, we've worked out that's why they're there. Wow, there's some weight behind them.
Yeah.
You know.
And quite often the women are on stage even when they're not saying
Yes.
something. And that's easy to forget if you're just reading the play.
Yes.
It's important to see the structure of a scene in that way.
Yes, although there is that unfortunate bit in one of the early scenes where Caesar slaps Calpurnia with the skin of the animal,
Yes.
make her pregnant because she's barren. We've not been, no idea that he might be the problem. Anthony, don't forget when you're running around to make sure you slap her with this animal skin. What on earth?
One of the trickier lines to direct these days, I would imagine.
Yes, and maybe one for the cutting room floor. But but yes, that's a very good point, because there are some productions I've seen also where Portia's in most of those scenes. But just because she doesn't speak doesn't mean there isn't a presence. And I think, of course,
exactly.
in performance, the body language tells us sometimes, if not as much more, in the relationship. Yes. Where are they positioned? And that's something you do have to consider. Something interesting in just in modern politics, as you brought up oligarchy earlier, just thinking about when you see Keir Starmer with his wife, and then you see Donald Trump with his. Interesting body language, about equal, or I see Portia and Brutus very much as equals in the home.
Right.
Interesting that she says, you have stolen ungently from my bed, almost like the home is her domain, and she can speak to him and she can tell him and she can be honest and be blunt, and there's no sense of being dragged around or trophy wife or not really wanting to be there. And it's interesting when I look at politicians and their partners, you get a glimpse into the dynamic of what actually goes on behind closed doors. And I think that's what Shakespeare's brilliantly doing in that scene in the orchard. Let's go into their domestic home. So it's not all affairs of state, even though they're talking about affairs of state. Let's put it in this domestic situation so we see a different side, a different aspect. The thing that we were really exploring in the 2024 production was the role of media in our political world. So going back to your point about the oligarchy, it's also exploring the role that media plays in that. And one thing I've been quite alarmed by is the amount of corporations as well as media outlets that have essentially, President Trump has said jump, and they said how high. Switching very late in the day in the election, switching sides, obviously seeing which, the writing was on the wall. And when you're in a world that's sort of majority capitalist, that's a bit frightening when someone has such a weight. I mean, I wonder whether it was the combination of Trump and Elon Musk is actually the push for lots of them. The richest man in the world and the most powerful political person in the world. If you're running a corporation and you want to get on, what do you do? But we were really investigating what role media has, particularly now we live in a world where we've got more than 5 channels on the TV, and there's so much mistrust in the media. And I wonder, I know, of course, Shakespeare hasn't got television, but he does have media, so things like letters, gossip, something that we always look at in rehearsal, transactions and communication. So how does the character know? What do they know? When do they know it? And most importantly, how do they know it? So again, in Julius Caesar, there's writings being thrown in at his window. Well, that Lucius finds and passes him a letter, and of course we find out later that it's Cassius has been writing them all, really. Well, there's a perfect example of sort of manipulation of the press in some ways, because you don't have to be that imaginative to say, well, those writings could be tweets, or they could be news articles, or they could be the world is telling me to do it. And so it's that was the thing that really was. I was most interested to investigate, because I think sometimes our media says we're just reporting the news without thinking about how they report it. Might be narrating the news, not reporting the news. I don't watch a great deal of TV actually, but recently I went home back to the Midlands, and my family watches quite a lot of ITV news. And I was surprised how the local ITV news reporter was giving their opinions on stories. So they would read the news article out, presumably off the prompt, off the auto cue, but then would add a few lines at the end about what they felt about it. And I turned to my mum and said, hang on a minute, this guy's just told us what to think about it. And she went, oh, but I like that because it's a bit more personal. And I thought, that's interesting. That's why TV's going down that line, like magazine shows rather than news, because they like personalities. Whereas maybe I'm old fashioned and a bit of an old fogey. When I listen to news, I just want the facts. I don't want your opinion on the facts necessarily.
That'd be nice.
I don't need somebody from a reality TV show to tell me what they think about it. I couldn't really care less. And so anyway, that's I think something interesting in that might be not Shakespeare's necessary his thinking of how does the media play a role in this, but having said that, inside the play, how news is reported, particularly when you get to the funeral scene, is one of the greatest forms of reporting or misreporting ever. And it's fascinating. We did quite a lot of work on this with, again, live cameras. Someone like Brutus, who I always felt was a bit Keir Starmer-ish sometimes, a bit boring, very cross the T's, dot the I's, that whole bit with the conspirators. No, we can't chop him up like he's serving for the dog. He has to be carved like for the gods, all of that sort of business. He has to get it all right on the page. Whereas some of the other conspirators like Ditus Brutus, it's just like, let's just chop him up. Let's just go for it. Should we do Mark Antony as well? But he's sort of very contractual. And in some ways, the straight guy, which is strange for being such a famous Shakespeare role. Whereas Antony's the wild card.
Yes, he is.
In many ways.
Much, yeah.
But isn't it interesting then in the funeral scene that Brutus doesn't really know how to talk to the people? And for it always strikes me as really stupid or incredibly ignorant, allows Antony to speak at the funeral. Yeah. Cassius stops him and says, can I have a word? You can't let him go up and do that. Oh no, he won't say anything against us. I mean, such political naivety.
Yes.
Antony's just some guy who's been hanging around in the first act. What we don't know is, or what they don't know, the audience does though, of course, brilliant dramatic irony from Shakespeare, is that we know he's not a boy anymore. The death of the father figure of Caesar has changed him, and in that Dogs of War stuff, he's different. He's not. He feels more to me like Hal and King Henry in the switch of a moment in the same play. There's Antony, the young, by the sound of it, sports jock, like doing the running the course and stuff. In the first act, a bit sort of nothing really between the ears. Antony do this, Antony do that, and he says yes, whatever Caesar says, and I'll do it, and blah blah blah. And the death of Caesar, the growth. And so then when he gets up and misreports, and there's this famous will, of course.
Yes.
You don't want me to read the will, do you? And we try different things like, was it an AI video will? Right. So and what we'd actually done is we'd got a video designer to actually create an actual AI version of the actor who played Caesar.
Right.
So to the audience, it would appear like it was just a recording of the actor. But in the program, we would have said, what you watched tonight was all AI created, which would make an audience hopefully go, oh my God, how scary is that? And that's one that maybe I shouldn't have said on the podcast because someone else might use that now. But just so they know, technically it's a nightmare. So that Antony's really surprises everybody. He's thought about, how do I make this thing burn? Again, though, not thinking about the consequences, coming from the thing in front of him, anger, frustration. Let's burn this whole thing up, and then ends up in this war in Act 4 and 5. So I know Shakespeare isn't exploring technology and the role of media, but he sort of is exploring the way that we find out information. And you could go back to some of the plays that with messenger speeches. Can you always believe the messenger? Well, I always say, let's assume we can, because otherwise we'll have a very cynical rehearsal room. But we also have to fact check as the play goes on. And I know it's not a documentary, but sometimes you go, hang on a minute, didn't the messenger say they were there? Now, has Shakespeare messed up and forgotten what the messenger said last time? Or has something happened that we've not been privy to? But it's people's word. And I don't think that's too dissimilar to someone posting on Facebook or TikTok. It's just someone else's word. And in a world where we don't like experts anymore, or we belittle experts, wasn't it Michael Gove's favourite thing? People are sick of one of his famous lines, people are sick of experts. I think he said that in 2019, was it? Unfortunate going into a pandemic. I think it was 2019. I might be misquoting. But interesting when you live in that world and you believe everything you read on a social media post. We're sort of doing that inside the plays. And I have no doubt, by the way, if he was writing now, he'd be using all of this tech. I have no doubt. I'd like to believe that if it got in the way of the actor-audience relationship, he wouldn't do it. He would change it. He would find a better way of doing it. But I believe he would be using every tool at his disposal to tell a story. But we'll never know, so we can have that debate in the pub.
My thanks to Ricky for taking the time to talk to us today. Please do look up Lazarus Theatre and Ricky's work via the links in the show notes. Next time, it's time to take a trip to Elsinore Castle and discover how a young student is reacting to the death of his father in suspicious circumstances. And I guess Hamlet needs no further introduction. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation for selected episodes. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.